Hello, this is the book review for Translated Woman Crossing the Borders with Esperanza's Story, and the author of this book is Ruth Behar. My name is Jason Foster, and I also worked with Megan Edmiston and Hannah Kreider on this presentation. So the first question that we talked about when we met to discuss the book, as Eric listed in our syllabus and on Blackboard, is the book research? And we all agreed absolutely this book is research. The amount of time and dedication to the book and to the subject is very clear when reading the book. So we sort of went through the steps of the structure of the book and really what makes it research. And the first thing we talked about was the preface, which establishes the framework for the book. And then the incorporation of literature, which the author really increasingly incorporates the literature review into the body of the chapters as the book goes along, and we'll touch on that a little more later. And then the reflections at the end of the book, the final chapters really come together to tie everything together, really with extensive context, connections, and reflections. And these chapters include a lot of information about Behar's story intersects with Esperanza's story. So because of all of these factors, we say absolutely yes, this book is definitely research. So then we looked at what type of narrative this is. So the book itself is a life history or a historia, and it focuses on the main character or the main, I guess, storyteller of the book, Esperanza, who's the Mexican woman that tells her story to Behar. And we also feel that it's ethnography because it addresses the experiences of Esperanza as a member of her culture. Which the author then interprets for us. But then we also had this discussion about whether it was a duo ethnography or not, because there's really a presence of the author in the narrative, and it continues to increase as Esperanza's story unfolds. So we sort of discussed the appreciation of this emergent design of the narrative. And again, so the second half of the book really draws on the connection between Esperanza's stories and Behar's experiences. So that's why we thought maybe the duo ethnography piece. We had a pretty good discussion about it. We debated it for a while, so we thought we would just throw that in there to let you all know what we discussed. But definitely life history and definitely ethnography mixed in there. So we then wanted to take a look at the data and the interviews that were used to write this book, that Behar used to write the book. So there's pre-interview data that Behar includes the entire history of her interactions with Esperanza, even those that occurred before the data was officially collected, such as the story of how she first met Esperanza. So this made us consider how important those are to setting the stage for the actual data collection phase. As far as descriptions, Behar's descriptions of the settings, the people, of her own reactions really make a convincing narrative and adds a great deal to the trustworthiness of the story or of the research. And she really began to provide, especially later in the book, really detailed examples of the culture. And the one example we had, there's a part where Behar actually meets with Chencha, which is a spiritual healer in Mexico, and she talks about learning from this healer and channeling those spirits. So these thick, rich descriptions of context really helped add to the story. And then also the connections. So there's our footnotes throughout the book. Footnotes for literature and methodology are placed throughout the books, but they're really subtle in the context of the narrative. But they really do work together to form an extensive list at the end of the book to validate the narrative further. And we discussed this again. We felt it was intentional that these footnotes were left out and made kind of subtle until the end of the book, because it really allowed Esperanza's story to speak out on its own rather than to be interpreted along the way. So you weren't reading and then stopping to read what a footnote was and continuing with the story. The way the footnotes were presented really allowed for a great flow of the story, but then the footnotes being placed at the end the way they were really validated what the author was saying, and proved that she really did extensive research and interviews and really a thorough review of the literature. So next, we discuss the social, cultural, and historical implications. We appreciated a lot of the aspects of how Behar was honest about Esperanza, honest about her culture, and how foreign the culture was for the author Behar. So the again that we talked about, the footnotes are all at the end of the book and references to them are subtle, so a reader could use the book as a straight narrative or more through an academic lens if they wanted to read it that way. The one thing we really appreciated is Behar did not translate the Spanish words at all, or not very much, at least at the beginning of the book. And then she did, at the very end, explain what a bunch of the terms and words meant, but we thought that the intentionally not translating Spanish words removed some of the privilege of the reader, to really simulate what it was like to be an outsider to that culture and really understand the author's experience and Esperanza's experience in that culture. And then finally, the reflection section at the end really contextualizes Esperanza's story in the field of feminist ethnography and in the scope of Mexican history, with some connections to American history. And Behar really focuses on the ways that women have been translated into different roles, and they're often silenced through these translations. So, how could the book be used? We had many reactions to this question. Um, we sort of all had the reaction that we appreciated the narrative and the methodology more as the book progressed, and we could see why Behar was structuring the story the specific way that she did. Um, it was intentional, we feel, the way she structured the book. It made it sometimes a little bit confusing, and sometimes the story got a little boring as you were trying to wrap your head around why she was telling you certain details, a certain part of the story. So that was interesting. Much of the first part of the book is simply Esperanza's story, which again, parts of it were maybe dry because they didn't have as much cultural implications as other parts. But as Behar begins to add her own story to her analysis, we really all began to appreciate her allowing Esperanza's early story to stand on its own. And then also the emergent design was helpful for us to really see an example of how to present a story that was balanced with the strong reflection and analysis sort of coming together to form the work as the final product came out. So, continuing along the lines of how this book can be used, again, Behar seamlessly incorporates her literature review in the form of quotations to frame each chapter, and it makes for almost unnoticeable footnote references. So, if someone wanted to read through the academic lens, or if they wanted to read, if they wanted to read without the academic lens just as a story, they can. But if they wanted to use that academic lens, all of the information to support everything that's being said in the narrative is all in the back of the book. And we felt this was a great way to do it, and it just provides a perfect example of how this book can be used to sort of frame similar stories or similar research of this nature. And then, as far as the interview questions um, are present in many cases, whether they're at the beginning of the chapter or mixed in or at the end, and the reader gets a sense of the interview settings and the dynamic without having chunks of the transcript or the clear division of speakers. It's really a smooth flowing story. So again, the book can be used just as a perfect example of how to do this, because I think it's rare to find such a good example of this. And this book may be one of the few good examples, at least as we discussed in our conversation, one of the few good examples we've seen of this type of work. And also, Behar mentions her family members who are present in the time of day and more about the settings of the interview. So really, she does many things well in this book that could just be taken away and used as we move forward. And the author just weaves everything together as a storyteller really well and provides this perfect example of how to do all of these things really seamlessly. So that is our presentation. we tried to focus on methodology as expected, which were covered in the first couple slides, and then we covered the data and interviews, and then gave you a couple slides on how this book could be useful to you in the future if you were thinking about doing this type of research. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to the discussion board, or you're also more than welcome to email any member of the group. Thank you.